So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. You will all be joining in listening mode only, and we'd ask that you please submit any questions or input using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be trying to answer questions as we go along, but we're conscious that this is a lunch and learn session, so time-wise we might be a little bit restricted. We will have some polls throughout the session as well for you to respond to, and we will be recording the session and we'll circulate a link of that afterwards. So with housekeeping out of the way, I'll start off with introductions. You'll also see the first of the polls popping up. So I will kick us off. I'm Amy, I'm a category buyer here at YPO within our HR services category. I manage several of our service-based frameworks, and I've previously worked in a local authority procurement team. My undergraduate studies were in law as well, so I've maintained a really keen interest in the procurement reform post-Brexit, both academically and professionally. So I'm here today to give us insight from the perspective of a buyer. Rahul, I'll pass to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rahul Robinson. I am the contracts manager at YPO. I look after legal and compliance for the business, and I'm also responsible for embedding procurement regulations and best practice in tender processes. To that end, I've been following the developments around the procurement reform extremely closely, and I'm currently reviewing the new procurement bill, which came out last week. So I am hoping I can bring some insight to the table into what the procurement reform might mean for public sector tendering, and I will pass you over to Jill.
Thank you both. So my name is Gillian Askew, and I am one of the co-founders and directors of Go4Growth. Go4Growth is a marketplace development organisation. I am a procurement professional by trade with nearly 30 years in both private and public sector. I'm also a long-standing micro and small business owner. But what Go4Growth is trying to do is help providers in the marketplace to navigate what is fairly complicated and complex world of public procurement regulations, and especially with the new regulatory environment coming into force next year. So I'm here to represent small businesses, the voluntary and community sectors today. Thank you.
So before we look at our agenda, I just wanted to outline a little bit more about why we're hosting this session. So I think we're all aware that procurement reform is coming, and YPO and Go4Growth recognise the platform that we've got to bring this information to the fore and to provide updates to the market. So hopefully you will find this discussion helpful. There should be another poll popping up as well, so we can understand a little bit more about who we've got with us on the session today. So looking at our agenda, we've outlined 3 key questions. So the first being, where are we now? So what practices are procurement professionals following post-Brexit, and what the changes might be, and what we can be doing to prepare for those changes. Looking at the changing of award criteria, so how meet versus match, which you might have heard about, and the impacts that will be, and again how providers can be preparing for these changes. And then finally we'll be looking at frameworks and dynamic pitches and systems, and how the new regulations will affect how bids are structured and how they operate. So we'll get started and look at procurement practices post-Brexit. So Jill, shall I pass to you?
Yeah, so I think what we wanted to do at this part was just have a think about what the current practices are and what the government is planning to change at a really super high level. And then what are the things that we can be thinking about now, both from a provider perspective, but also from a procurement perspective. So Rahul, if I can come to you first, would you give us just a really high level overview of where we are now in public procurement?
Yep, sure. I'll certainly try to keep it as high level as I can. So public procurement post-Brexit is very similar to how it looked before Brexit, with a few minor changes, assuming there may be some potential suppliers on the call who may not be familiar with those practices. So I'm going to run over them really quickly. One of the biggest changes to have occurred in the last few years is the destination where public bodies like YPO have to publish our tender opportunities. So in the past, we used to do this on the official journal of the European Union via a website called TED. And now we do it via the .gov website on a platform called Find a Tender and Contracts Finder. And if you're wondering why more than one platform, it's because one covers publication of UK opportunities and the other focuses on English opportunities, and also contains some details of some under threshold opportunities as well. And there's regional tools available in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. What I would say about that is, if you're not familiar with them, I do recommend you Google them and check them out. I find they work really well. There's lots of clear information on opportunities on there. So they're really useful for finding new contracting opportunities. and you can also set up alerts for free. So they're definitely worth checking out. The other big change, I suppose, that happened was the introduction of the National Procurement Policy Statement, which doesn't directly affect suppliers, but it sets out the government priorities for public procurement for the Parliament period to come. On the last publication, they covered social value, commercial delivery, skills and capability development. And for suppliers, I suppose the biggest change in there was that they introduced a requirement that public bodies publish a forward pipeline of procurement opportunities, which I'm hoping also will help sort of suppliers plan out resourcing when you might need to respond to particular opportunities, or give you a chance to engage with contracting authorities early. The only problem with that is that there's no direct place to publish these pipelines. People attending, or contracting authorities are doing it on their websites, not in any central place, although that might change in the future. So that is the current, that's where it looks like, that's what it looks like at the moment.
Okay, and are there, and again, I know we're working at really high level today, but are there some big changes that we think are coming from the government that change what you've just described?
Not what I've just described, but there are changes coming that will affect suppliers. So the webinar we did yesterday for procurement professionals, what I argued was that in terms of how we run tenders, not a lot of changes were coming. I said that it was going to provide innovation, it was going to unlock potential, but it didn't mandate that we do things particularly different. From a supplier perspective, I think the changes are slightly more radical, but largely all to the good. So there's three that I've kind of picked out for today that I kind of wanted to bring forward. One is something I've mentioned a lot in the past, which is around the centralized digital platform. And what this is, it's a big ambitious promise from the Cabinet Office. And this platform's designed to keep information relating to public contracts all in one place. That information includes things like commercial tools, like frameworks and dynamic marketplaces you could join, contract performance data for contracts that have been let via KPIs, a list of central departments that essentially suppliers who can't supply to the public sector. And most excitingly in that digital platform is a central register of suppliers, where you will essentially be able to provide your core information, and then buyers and contracting authorities can download that information and use that to support your bid. And the logic behind that is that it should cut down on the amount of form filling you have to do when tenders are made available. And it will hopefully deliver what the ESP failed to do. And make the process a little bit easier. I would put a proviso, though, at this point, that in the current bill, as I've read it, there's a lot of obligations for us to publish a lot of information, but not much detail as to where, including how this digital platform will work. So really, I'm waiting on more details from the Cabinet Office on this centralized platform that will hopefully help us understand how it's going to work. There's two other changes I kind of wanted to bring forward as well, if I could. The second one was around the open contracting data standard, which again is around transparency in the process. And one of the big things that came out of the green paper was the idea that we would have to publish winners tenders. So if you won an opportunity, you would then have to publish your tender to other bidders, so they understood why you won a contract. Subject to redaction, of course, but when I've mentioned it in the past, it's received a very negative reception with suppliers, and it was kind of difficult to imagine how it was going to work. But luckily, it was dropped in the revisions to the green paper, and instead, what we're going to be doing moving forward when the new rules come into force is we will be publishing our evaluation notes for you instead. And I think that's going to be relieving to a lot of suppliers without necessarily compromising the benefits that can be garnered from publishing more information. But it does admittedly create a bit of a headache for us as a contracting authority to have to work out how to redact those evaluation notes instead. But for suppliers, it should definitely help. And the last thing I kind of wanted to bring forward today was around the supply chain itself. So there's going to be a lot more transparency and emphasis on processes for fair payments all the way through the supply chain. So most notably for suppliers right now, the bill as it exists contains a clause for implied terms that will automatically be inserted into subcontracts. So essentially not a contract between YPO and yourselves, but the contract between yourselves and your suppliers, if that contract is for the purposes of delivering that primary public contract. And what that's going to require you to do, the implied term in there, is that you pay your contractors within 30 days of a receipt of invoice, and an identical requirement is going to be placed on contracting authorities to pay you within 30 days. What I would say on that is this is just in the bill at the moment. This is not a law, so it could change before it's enacted, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that it exists at this stage. Also, the bill's only done half the job so far. Not all of the agreed amendments that were in the green paper are necessarily in the bill. So there were other things in the bill, such as in the green paper, such as subcontractors having access to the contracting authority escalating payment issues, and also a right for contracting authorities to review payment performance down the supply chain. And those aren't included in the bill at the moment. So I'm fully expecting to see those kind of things come up in secondary legislation or PPNs if the Cabinet Office follows through with its previous commitments. And for me, I think practically, with the short time that we've got, those are the things that stuck out to me most from the bill and the green paper that I thought was worth raising today that will change in the future.
Okay, Raoul, that is super helpful. Thank you very much. Amy, just before we move on to the next slide, are you seeing any golden threads of advice that you're giving to procurement professionals yourself? Are there things that we can be doing now in procurement that will be helpful for providers as the regulations change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Raoul touched on, the changes to actual procurement practices won't be that huge, other than around transparency and what else we will need to put out there. But we saw the reference to unleashing procurement throughout the green paper so much, and I think as procurement professionals, that's what we can really jump on now, and we can start engaging with our suppliers in a better way, educating around what you can expect from the future once the changes happen. Start really digging down into the planning and pipelining and what we can share, and perhaps how we can share that in a better way moving forwards. I know we'll be touching on award criteria on our next slide, so I won't go into that, but there's certainly an opportunity for us now as professionals to break down these barriers that we do know exist, and really pave the way for the innovative unleashed procurement that we want to see moving forwards.
Yeah, and that, as you say, it's all about engagement, isn't it? It's about talking to the provider marketplace. It's about talking early and talking as much as you possibly can, so that learning is two-way. That's brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Can you move us on to the next slide?
Okay.
So I know we've talked about transparency, but we're going to try and cover three things just over the next slide if we can. So if we talk about transparency of award criteria, Raoul, I'm going to put this question to you around that clarity of award criteria in the future, and setting an expectation for suppliers around how they will be judged and what contracts are going to be awarded on. Are there any changes that we should expect to see coming out of that?
So with the bill in its current draft, it's looking very likely that award criteria, as it's displayed at the moment in various factors like costs, delivery, quality, and social value and so forth, will continue. So I think you can expect that you will continue when you look at a tender or a notice, that you will still see the split. And I'm also expecting the way that we weight those criteria, which YPO particularly does as a percentage, will also continue. But in terms of transparency on that criteria, what the bill currently says is that it must relate to the subject matter of the contract, it must be clear, measurable, and specific, and must be proportionate means of assessing a tender, which is all new. The bill also says that contracting authorities must provide bidders with the assessment methodology, so how it's going to rank the importance of each award criteria and how it's going to effectively evaluate tenders, which they say can be done as a percentage of ranking, or rather open-ended, it says, by describing it in another way. I'm still fully expecting most opportunities to be continuing to use a percentage or a ranking basis and still to split those things out. And largely in terms of transparency for those things, I would still expect contracting authorities to embed it into their tender documents. But there is an expectation, I think, moving forward, depending on how the new notices look. When we publish a notice that an opportunity is coming, we may have to provide a lot more detail upfront before you even look at the documents as to what that criteria is, how we're splitting out, and possibly the methodology at that point, although we are waiting on details from the Cabinet Office as to what they're expecting to see in those notices still.
And I think the preparedness, that period that comes before a competition opens, the amount of time that a provider marketplace has to prepare is really crucial. And so there's a key needs almost statement, isn't there? If we, this opportunity might come live in 6 months, we think we're going to need this kind of insurance. We think this will be the award criteria. We think, this is what we'll need in terms of accreditation or licensing or skill set, capability, competence, all the rest of it. The more I think that we can do that well in advance of a competition starting or a procurement process going live, the better equipped the marketplace will be to be ready for that. so that we can really inspire that breadth of competition. And I think that takes me into, very nicely actually, a question I want to put to you, Amy, if I can. So at the moment, a public procurement is judged on something called the most economically advantageous tender, the MEAT assessment. And it looks like that's going to change to the most advantageous tender, a MAT assessment. So that removal of the word economic, I'm wondering whether you think that's actually going to make a great deal of difference. When we've talked to providers in Go for Growth, what they've said is actually this is still a race to the bottom on price. And we're not sure that MEAT to MAT will make any difference whatsoever to this being more about value and quality. Do you have an instinctive look at this at all?
Yeah, I think that at that top level, MEAT to MAT, it's really easy to look at and say, does it mean anything? In a practical sense, probably not. As we're all touched upon, we're probably going to see award criteria set out and used in the same way, that price, quality, social value evaluations. But I think what the change does do is recognise the ability of procurement and what it can achieve above and beyond savings. So I think when we think about procurements, particularly in the public sector, that's how they're measured, what savings has been achieved. And I think that's probably a little bit where the connection with lowest price must win has come from. I think for me, I would hope that perception isn't true and that it's value for money at its core. However, you know, we need to take that feedback that comes from the supply base. But I think what MEAT to MAT does is give procurement professionals the ability to go back to their organisations and say, I've looked at this market, I've looked at this contract, and this is actually what we need to measure and throughout our process, but afterwards as well. And I need you to be looking at what we have achieved and saying, wow, look at the improvements that the end user has benefited from, and look at what you've achieved in terms of social value, as well as savings. Budgets are always going to be tight. Price is always going to factor in. MEAT to MAT will never change that, and it shouldn't do, because we are talking about public sector budgets here. But I think what it will do is hopefully change the way procurement professionals think and are measured moving forwards.
Yeah, so and I think it gives a license to think about value perhaps in a different way, doesn't it? To be not scared. So you're right, no procurement person should ever apologise for worrying about the money. That's what we're there to do. It's a governed profession for a reason in the public sector. This is taxpayers' money. But value for money is quite subjective, and understanding what that needs to look like from a procurement perspective. Hopefully the transition from most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender will give some encouragement to procurement and commissioners. Actually, it's not all just the procurement teams. You know, this comes right through the whole commissioning process to really think about value in potentially a different way and not be scared to think about value in a different way. And again, when we talk to providers, there's so much talent and access to innovation in the provider market. It would be great to see these things coming together a little bit through that engagement process that you talked about, Amy, in terms of asking the provider market what value could look like, what are we able to do, what's the art of the possible, I guess, and making that a real two-way conversation where we really use the marketplace's talent and capability to help us form and drive what our procurement competitions might look like in the future.
I think as well, Jill, you've touched on a really good point there, is that engagement is going to be so important. And I think there can be nervousness around that stage of the procurement currently. But what I'm seeing here is a response from the government that essentially says, go and do the procurement that you want to do in the best way that you can to realise that value. So hopefully we'll see some more of that coming forward as well.
Yeah, I do think there's reason for optimism, you know, from a provider market perspective and from a procurement perspective. I think there is really good reason for optimism, because there is an encouragement for creativity in there. There is an encouragement to really get into the ribs of what the market has to offer and what value looks like, which is really good to see that written down. Is really good news. And there are, so a PPN, for anybody that doesn't know what a PPN is, and I always get this wrong, it's a procurement policy note. Is that right, Rahul? Have I got that right? Thank you.
That's fun.
So they come out of the Cabinet Office and they help procurement understand what they've got, what they can use, any changes to regulation or legislation, etc. And there was a procurement policy note that came out in November 2020 that said under threshold procurement, so where actually the legal elements don't kick in, you are able to reserve a procurement for either a geographical area or for a small to medium enterprise. And so actually, there are mechanisms that's in place now where contracting authorities, public sector organisations can really start to identify where small to medium enterprises should be accessed in the market. Amy or Raoul, are you seeing reservation of procurements grow in popularity? Are you seeing that being taken up by the procurement community? Do you think there'll be more of that under the new regulations?
I think, to jump in, sorry, Raoul, that at YPOs level, because we're typically contracting for frameworks and solutions that we're putting out, we're above threshold and therefore this wouldn't apply. If I put myself back into a local authority headspace, if I was in that team, I think that there would probably be a demand from some of our service areas to want to do this and to want to realise the possibility. But I wonder if procurement professionals would struggle to identify actually which of their procurements could go there. And I think that it's in itself comes back to a bigger picture around pipelining and planning. So maybe this is something that we will see a bigger reliance on moving forwards. Raoul, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, so just a few thoughts really. It's worth remembering that the SME and geographical reservations we're talking about for a below threshold procurement exist under the current PPN. It's also worth noting under the new bill for above threshold tenders, there's also going to be separate reservations for supported employment providers and public service mutuals. I think regarding whether there has been an increase in reservations since the PPN, I can't say that I've personally seen the data to kind of support that notion. But as Amy said, that might be reflective of the kind of environment we work in at the moment. But similar to other areas under these new rules, and like we've been saying sort of repeatedly now, I suppose, there is loads of potential there. And I think there's a big education piece that could be done around how reserve contracts work that could be delivered. Because I personally wonder how many reserve contract opportunities are really missed because either the contracting authority doesn't understand the rules well enough or supplier engagement is missed up front. The other question I've kind of got on the back of this, thinking about PPNs that exist at the moment, is whether the PPNs will continue to apply when the new rules come in, because there's been no instruction or guidance on that particularly at the moment, which is something I kind of need to go away and ask the Cabinet Office. But since we're talking about under threshold procurements, I can't see the new rules or new PPNs, unless they're directly contradicting it, will change that outcome. So it's very likely that the commitment towards sort of reserve contracts for SMEs and geographical reservations will continue.
Well, thank you. I think just before we move on to the last slide, I think for me there is a point that all of these opportunities, whether they're reserved under threshold or not, or they're over threshold opportunities, putting them in front of the provider marketplace is really crucial. And currently the main, if not the only way of doing that, is through a procurement portal. So you either see it on Contracts Finder or Find a Tender Service, which will direct you to the authority's procurement portal of choice. And lots of the provider market are active on other platforms such as LinkedIn, Facebook or Twitter, and are perhaps not seeing necessarily the opportunity, whether it is reserved for local small providers in a particular area or not. And so I think you're right, Amy, there's some process mechanisms that need to bolt together. In isolation, just doing something slightly different to the way that we've always done it probably won't bring about hugely different results either for the contracting authority or for the marketplace. So we probably need to put the jigsaw puzzle together a little bit better. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Amy? And so this is the last piece that we're going to run through. We're going to have a look at frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems. So Amy, just to kick us off with this, would you give us an overview about what they both are and how they work?
Yeah, absolutely. So frameworks can be considered as a procurement tool which help to connect suppliers with public sector organisations. Typically, a framework is tendered and then will last for 4 years. So if suppliers aren't appointed at the start of that process, they can't bid again to join until the whole framework is up for renewal. So it's usually a cyclical process. Frameworks provide a route to market for public sector organisations without the need to run a full open procurement process. So that's why they're a popular procurement tool, essentially. They can save some time in the process and you're being put in contact with what can be deemed a pre-approved set of appliers. Typically, a framework will permit both something known as a direct award, so you're appointing to a supplier without reopening a competition, and further competitions which do exactly what they say in the tin. They take the suppliers who've been appointed to the framework and they run a further competition to establish which provider would be the meet tenderer in the current circumstances. Frameworks typically will be established by PBOs like YPO, and while being on a framework is a good way of being in contact with the public sector and a good opportunity, it is not a guarantee of work, and that's something that should always be kept in mind. I'm conscious of time, so I won't talk about terms and conditions and things like that in relation to frameworks, but happy to pick up any conversations if people have questions around that separately. So if we look at a dynamic purchasing system, also known as a DPS, so by contrast to a framework, this is open throughout its lifetime for new providers to bid to join at any time, and that really is probably the key distinction. So DPSs usually also last for around 4 years, and again, they're a procurement tool that's putting the public sector in contact with suppliers. But the main point, I think, from a provider perspective to note here is that a DPS does not permit a direct award. So they can only be utilised for a further competition. So if you're appointed to a DPS, in order to gain any work, you will need to go through that competitive process for the contracting authority in question. So they're great for markets that are ripe with innovation, where there's new suppliers, new solutions. But I think, again, just to note that there's no guarantee of work through a DPS as there is with a framework. Does that cover everything in a nutshell for you, Jill?
It does. I do think they're a good construct. They're a good place for providers of any size or in any sector to be, and I definitely encourage them. But it is important that people understand how they're constructed and that they're not necessarily a guarantee of work in its own right. And I think, Raoul, in the regulations, there is a dynamic market proposed, and it would be really interesting if you could give us a high-level overview of what the dynamic market will be and what it can be used for, and whether that would replace frameworks and DPSs.
So the dynamic marketplace is going to replace the DPS, but not frameworks. They're being dealt with separately under the regulations. So in essence, what a dynamic marketplace is new terminology for the DPS Amy has just described. So suppliers are going to be able to join a dynamic marketplace at any time while the market is open, and that's typically going to be open for a number of years. There's no restriction on that number of years, but practically you're talking between sort of 4 and 8 years that one of these things might be open. Your application is going to have to be digital, meaning you're going to have to submit through an e-tendering platform, which could be confusing if you end up with lots of dynamic marketplaces all using different e-tendering systems, and that's something the Cabinet Office are looking at themselves. Your application would then be reviewed, and then hopefully you'll be accepted onto this marketplace and you become an approved supplier. At that point, you're able to bid for opportunities published via that marketplace. So to be clear, membership of the dynamic marketplace doesn't guarantee you a public contract, but it does guarantee you an opportunity to bid for certain public contracts that you would otherwise be excluded from. The difference between the DPS we have now and the dynamic marketplace is largely nominal. I'd say the biggest change is probably the name, but other than that, the other change is the removal on the limit for what you can use them for. So currently we can only set up a DPS for commonly purchased goods. It's often described as anything you can get off the shelf. It is kind of how it's commonly described in procurement circles, but that limit is being removed. So I'm fully expecting to see a lot more dynamic marketplaces launching in the future when the regulations come into force.
And so suppliers will be able to join all of the time in the same way that they can a DPS at the minute, a dynamic purchasing system at the moment. It will be always open in that sense.
Correct. It will be always open, so you can join at any time. You obviously won't be able to bid for any opportunities that were running before you joined, obviously, but anything after you've joined, you should have as equal opportunity as everyone else. What I would say about that, though, of course, because it's always open, that means the potential pool of suppliers grows over time, so the amount of competition grows over time, which is also worth bearing in mind.
And suppliers can come off as well as go on, can't they? They can opt out and in. It works both ways. Suppliers can come in and come out. I think I understand. Is that right on a DPS and will be right for the dynamic marketplace, or is it usually just joining rather than leaving?
So it's not embedded in the procurement bill that there is a right to leave as well as join, but I suspect, much like YPO, there will be a mechanism built into the contract terms that are applied to these marketplaces that say, in order to leave, you will contact us this way and we will remove you from opportunities. But I would also state on that, and it will be YPO's policy when the dynamic marketplaces come back in, I suspect, that if you leave under your own steam, you feel it's not worth your time being on there anymore, it doesn't stop you joining again later on in the future. So you could well see a big ebb and flow, possibly, of suppliers joining these things when they know opportunities are coming and then leaving again when that particular opportunity is gone. But it's effectively a free market largely.
Okay. And I think just one final thing to say, or to reiterate if we said it already, the DPS as it stands today, and this may be different for the dynamic marketplace, but I wouldn't rely on the alert services for a dynamic purchasing system right now. Go look for them in the portals if you're a provider and you want to see what dynamic purchasing systems are out there. And that's largely because they are always open, and that always open nature means that the advert really only goes once at the beginning. And so if you're just relying on alert services, you might not get an alert to see it. I think that's it for this last slide. If we get on to the next slide, I know that is just for open questions. I think what we've agreed, Amy and Raoul, is that we'll do a live Q&A session. So because the lunch and learn is quite short, I think we're probably at time, are we, Amy?
You just ticked over as you said that question.
Right. Okay. So I think if we are going to close the session down now, what we would say is if you have any questions at all, please, you can put them into the chat now, or you can send them over to us in slower time. But look out for event in the future where we do live Q&A on the regulatory changes. So hopefully today has been helpful and useful to everybody. And I think that's it from us. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining.